Welcome. Fascism began in Italy, and, to borrow from Benito Mussolini, the first fascist dictator, fascism was never intended for export. Instead, following the Great War, as paramilitary activity increased throughout Western Europe, Mussolini's paramilitary group slowly but surely consolidated power in war-torn Italy, initially intimidating but then proscribing most political opposition. They then turned to the future by turning to the past, the deep Italian past of ancient Rome. Today, we'll look at the first decade of Italian fascism, analyzing its left-wing roots along with its right-wing concessions and subsequent domestic transformation. Along the way, we'll also compare early fascist political platforms with those of Germany's National Socialists. Mussolini and his fascists were certainly long on style, but were they short on substance? The story of fascism begins with one of the ambiguities of the Great War, that is, with paramilitary activity, specifically that of the Fasci di Combattimento. This translates into English as combat leagues. It was founded in 1919 by Benito Mussolini, and, as with so much else at the time, the Great War looms large here. Before the war, Mussolini had been a socialist, and he was fairly influenced by Karl Marx. But after the war began, he began advocating intervention. However, the Italian Socialist Party, of which Mussolini was a member, advocated neutrality, and this resulted in Mussolini's expulsion. He fought in the Great War, but was injured in a grenade blast and released from military duty. But although Italy eventually joined the Allies, its victory was Pyrrhic. In 1919, its economy was in shambles. Millions were unemployed, and the cost of living had quadrupled since 1913, the year before the Great War began. The unrest proved a boon to Italian socialists, who soon won a number of elections, although most Italian socialists saw the Russian Revolution as too extreme. Revolution was very much in the air. Between 1919 and 1921, in both industrial and agricultural sectors, millions participated in thousands of strikes. Italy was a country on the verge of a class-based civil war, and it was in this context that Mussolini's Fasci emerged as an anti-Bolshevik paramilitary organization. And this means that the Fasci were willing to use violence, and they did. Political conditions continued to deteriorate, and in late October 1922, the Fasci marched on Rome in what proved to be a failed bid to take over the government. But the Fasci did not seize power. Instead, the king declared martial law and appointed Mussolini prime minister. So, were the fascists left-wing or right-wing? Here we need to go back much further in history. The distinction between left-wing and right-wing politics originated in the French Revolution. In 1789, the National Assembly, one of the early revolutionary governments, debated what to do about the French monarchy. Those who sat on the left wanted to abolish the monarchy. Those who sat on the right wanted to keep it. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, the division over monarchy, whether to keep it or abolish it, became the central dividing point between left and right-wing politics. And it remained this way into the 20th century. But also important here is religion. Left-wing politics tended to be more hostile to religion, especially when religion was either state-sponsored or when membership in a state church was required for full civic participation. Fascism became a mixture of what were, at the time, both left-wing and right-wing ideas. We see this evolution quite clearly by analyzing programmatic documents published in 1919 and 1921. In 1919, the Fasci published their first platform. It contains multiple points that fully squared with left-wing politics of the day. For example, the Fascists demanded that an 8-hour workday be made normative. They further demanded that education be strictly secular, and they attacked the wealth of the Catholic Church. calling for the abolition of episcopal revenues and the seizure of all goods belonging to congregations. The platform also made economic demands. Quote, "On the financial front, we demand a large progressive tax on capital that would amount to a one-time partial expropriation of all riches." This probably reveals something of Mussolini's socialist background. The call for a progressive income tax was also found in the Communist Manifesto. But note the use here of the word expropriation. In his book Das Kapital, Karl Marx believed that centralized production would be among those developments that destroyed capitalism. In a famous turn of phrase, he wrote, "The knell of capitalist private property sounds. The expropriators are expropriated." The years between 1919 and 1921 also saw important developments. Perhaps most noteworthy was a newfound clear articulation of how fascists envisioned the Italian nation. They stated it most efficiently in the penultimate paragraph of the 1921 program. The nation stands above all social classes. In the background here was the concern about class warfare, and this became a bright line of fascist belief: the elevation of the nation over all other differences. In 1921, the fascists further defended private property, writing, "Fascism recognizes the social function of private property." The program then rejected collectivization, which had been imposed in Bolshevik Russia. Nonetheless, the fascists maintained some of their older left-wing stances, such as the 8-hour workday. And finally, however secular and even atheistic the fascists aspired to be, the Catholic Church was probably the most influential opponent of the Bolsheviks. Consequently, the fascists now called only for greater separation of church and state. By 1924, the Fascist Party could point to significant areas of political victory. They received more than half of all votes in the 1924 election, and by then, the strikes and unrest of recent years had largely become memory. The economy also improved, although the same is true of European nations more broadly. But now we come to a simple fact, one that pertains to all political history, and not just that of extreme movements. Simply stated, it doesn't matter what the goals of a movement actually are. At some point, it will encounter opposition. The question then becomes, how do you negotiate your own ambitions with those of others? The history of fascism after 1922 is, in some significant ways, about the domestication of fascism. And this is seen nowhere more clearly than in looking at how fascists dealt with both the Italian monarchy and the Catholic Church. Mussolini and the fascists were powerless to overthrow either one. When it comes to the monarchy, fascism now encompassed diverging approaches. Some, like Mussolini, remained hostile to monarchy, while others supported it. Arguably more important was religion. Rome is not just the capital of Italy, it is also the home of the Pope. By 1923, the fascists were already giving preferential treatment to Catholicism. The earlier demand for secular education was thus abandoned, and the Catholic Catechism was now taught in schools. This new stance came to a head in 1929 with the Lateran Pacts. They involved reimbursing the Church for past acts of theft, and also granted to the Vatican political autonomy, thus making the Vatican an independent state. The Church in turn limited the direct political involvement of clergy and religious orders. In the program of 1921, the fascists laid great emphasis upon the study of Latin. In fact, the very term fascism comes from the Latin word fasces. The fasces was a bundle of rods gathered together around an axe. In ancient Rome, the fasces symbolized unity, as many rods are harder to break than just one. And the fasces also symbolized rule, with the axe symbolizing authority. For a paramilitary movement, this was no doubt an attractive symbol. And there are still other ways in which the fascists played up their Italian heritage, a heritage that was defined by the lost glory of ancient Rome. For example, in 1932, in celebration of the March on Rome, a giant obelisk resurrected that carried the Latin inscription, Mussolini Dux, that is, Mussolini, leader. Beneath the obelisk was placed a document now known as the Codex Fori Mussolini, It opened with a citation of the fourth eclogue of the ancient Roman poet Virgil. Magnus ab integro saeclorum nascitur ordo, that is, the great order of the ages is born anew. Virgil likely wrote the fourth eclogue about Caesar Augustus, the emperor who transformed Rome from a republic into a monarchy. But Christians had long interpreted it as an unwitting messianic prophecy about the coming of Jesus. Consequently, the fascist use of this same passage not only reveals a dependence upon the most famous of ancient Roman poets, but arguably also revels in a quasi-messianic reapplication of the same passage to Mussolini. One more example should suffice: the construction, beginning in 1937, of the Areopagus Museum. Areopagus is Latin for altar of peace, an actual altar constructed and dedicated during the reign of Caesar Augustus. In 1938, the entirety of a first-century text, the Deeds of the Divine Augustus, was carved into the wall of the museum. The Deeds of the Divine Augustus is a first-century autobiographical text written, quite possibly, by Caesar Augustus himself. In it, Caesar Augustus detailed how he saved Rome from civil war. In all of these ways, fascism romanticized the Roman past, and in this, it developed its own philosophy of history, a view very different than the Marxist notion of inevitable communist equality. The fascist view of history was both declensionist, that is, believing that things had gotten worse, but also restorationist, that is, believing that a lost glory was now returning. So what? So what about the Nazis? In truth, whether in 1919, 1922, or 1932, no one would have predicted an alliance between fascists and Nazis. Let's look at an early proto-Nazi document, the 1919 Guidelines of the German Workers' Party. Its opening line reads, "The German Workers' Party is a socialist organization composed of all folk comrades engaged in mental and physical work." If this sounds odd, that's okay. The Nazis were famously anti-Bolshevik, but the Bolsheviks were just one socialist group. As we continue reading the guidelines, we find something else: anti-Semitism. We fight against drones in the state, most of whom are Jews. They live the good life and reap what they have not sown. They control us and rule us with their money. And then, the guidelines oppose a central Marxist conviction: the so-called dictatorship of the proletariat. Our fight is for justice, true freedom, and happiness. No dictatorship of the proletariat. Equal justice for all. Later Nazi documents repeated both the anti-Bolshevik and the anti-Semitic content found here. This doesn't overlap too much with Mussolini's Fasci, but, like many citizens in their own countries, both Hitler and Mussolini believed that the New World Order, sought by the League of Nations, was bad for Germany and Italy. Initially, Mussolini sought to change this by proposing, in 1933, an alliance with Britain, France, and Germany, but this went nowhere. It did, however, become the starting point of a new, if sometimes halting, phase of Italian-German relations. It was the 1935 Italian invasion of Ethiopia that changed things. Britain was especially opposed to the invasion, so Mussolini needed support, and thus he turned to Hitler, who gave it. Upon proclaiming the Italian Empire in 1936, Nazi Germany became the first country to recognize the new empire. In the coming years, both Germany and Italy continued to pursue international relations with other countries ranging from the Soviet Union to Britain. But the need for allies amidst their imperial saber-rattling pushed the two dictators closer together. And then the ideological shifts came. Italy adopted a series of race laws based upon those in Nazi Germany. Although the Fasci never fully embraced Nazi anti-Semitism, greater ideological unity facilitated political alliance and the eventual downfall of each regime. If you're interested in learning more, these books are worth consulting. Most important is the translation of key documents. First is a primer of Italian fascism, which is translated by a team of scholars and edited by Jeffrey T. Schnapp. From early fascist platforms to later elaborations by fascist intellectuals, it's an expansive introduction. Next is the Codex Fori Mussolini, a Latin text of Italian fascism, edited and translated by Han Lammers and Bettina Reitz-Jus. It contains a generous introduction and then a bilingual edition of the work, revealing the fascist philosophy of history. Finally, we need a biography of Mussolini. Read Peter Neville's Mussolini, recently revised in a second edition. It's an excellent starting place. It covers dispassionately Mussolini's youth, his meteoric rise, and his ultimately disastrous leadership. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button, feel free to leave a comment, and I'll see you next time.